Hey, I'm at base.
Okay, so we are at Chaf Hey Amid Beis, the bottom Mishnah, the second of the two. It's about a half a dozen lines from the bottom. We finished that Mishnah last week, the top one. So we just started this Mishnah, so we'll repeat the Mishnah and get into the Gemara. Says the Mishnah, Motza Begal Ubekosel Yashan. Walking along, he sees a pile of stones or an old wall, and he just puts his hand in it, or he sees something and it attracts his attention, and he picks it out. Says the Mishnah, Hare Elu Shalom. Don't have to announce, nothing. That kind of find does not require any announcement. We'll see in a minute, we'll understand what's going on. Also says the Mishnah, Matzah B'Kosel Chadash, if he's walking along and he passes a walled compound, let's say, that has a fairly new, and we're going to see what the definition of new and old is. The Gemara will attempt to give us that. Matzah B'Kosel Chadash. So the Mishnah says, Michetzia v'lechut shalo, approximately from the middle of that wall, if you can approximate if the wall is 3 feet or 4 feet thick or whatever it is, Michetzia v'lechut shalo, to the finder, Michetzia v'lefnim shabalabayis. From the inner half belongs to the balabayis of the house, the outer half belongs to the finder. Again, we'll understand that shortly. If the house that he had was a rental house to others, and then he cleans up after the rental and finds something of value, what should he do? Says the Mishnah, even if it's in the middle of the house, there's no question that it was to whoever was in the house. It's not a question of outside or inside. Still, he does not have to announce. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. It's like a pile of stones from a wall that came down. Okay. One of the holes of the wall that is samach Rishus Harabim, Matzah from the width of the kaisel, we believe that someone walked along, for whatever reason, stuck it into the wall, even if he had intention to come back. Shachach, he forgot. The afagav the amrin el sofek yinuach lo yitol. In last week's Gemara, we presented the concept of sofek yinuach. If you think there's a doubt as to whether or not someone hid something. So therefore, that had to do with the birds that hopped. So there was two shitas. One shita that the birds just hopped from nowhere and came here, and therefore you don't have to announce. And one was sofek yinuach, that he put it there. And the context is sofek yinuach, you shouldn't take it. And if you take it, says the Gemara, lo yachzir, you're stuck with it. Either someone will come along or Eliyahu. So in other words, so this concept, so Rashi says, lo yitel. So this is a sofek yinuach l'chayra. I mean, a guy you find something in the wall, you can at least contemplate that he put it there to come back, and that's a sofek yinuach. Rashi v'hai vade yinuachu. There's no sofek yinuach. This is vade yinuach, right? So nevertheless, he says, even though this is vada yinuach, not sofek yinuach, because it didn't make its way into the wall by itself. So someone clearly stuffed it in there, and that's a vada, not a sofek. So why would you think that you should be able to take it? So the Mishnah comes and tells us the shotach tfei, the ikka years balim, that if a person puts it into a wall that's to the public, and then he forgets, and then he remembers, a month later, he says, oh, no, that's gone. Someone will clearly have already taken it, so the power of years overtakes the power of a niyur. That's how Rashi explains it. By renting it out. Below Yodua Deman Ninu Ubalov no. So Rashi says that the person who lived there will not think twice about being miyayesh after he leaves, because he figures, all right, if this is a rental, then it's been rented out, and someone else took it, and he wouldn't have any havamina who that person is. So in other words, remember, this is all now dependent on yiush. Was there yiush? Did he give up? And when he gave up. Those are the two critical factors we're going to see in the Gemara. The when is as important as the if. And here we're taking the position that the renter already was miyayish, because he says, oh, this was already rented out to somebody else. Forget about it. I won't know. So those are the main statements of the Mishnah. Now the Gemara is going to embellish and try to have us understand. So the first question is, when someone finds something in a stone wall that fell or a kaisel yashan, why he's allowed to keep it? Tana, we learn a brisa. Very interesting concept. So first of all, let's look at Rashi, because this didn't happen in Bavel. This happened in Eretz Yisrael, even though it's Talmud Bavli, but he's quoting from something that happened in Eretz Yisrael. Tana gabi gal the kaisel yashin sheyachaloim lo labala gal or labala kosel shel amoroim shehabishu aviseinu haya. This goes back to the time of the Amoroim, the time of the capture of Eretz Yisrael, Aknani, V'Achiti, V'Hamori, V'Achivi, V'Yehusi. In other words, we're now going back to the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. So that brisa says that the finder could say, what are you talking about? This goes back hundreds, if not 1,000 years. There's no concept of course it was miyayish. There's no question it was miyayish. So that's how the brisa wants to explain why, in the case of something that's old, how old is it? So he's saying Shalom Aroimim. Break the Gemara Otto Amorim Mitzane Yisrael Lo Mitzane. You're saying it was Amorim. It could have been Yisraelim. There were Jews around at the time too. They also could have put it into the wall. Says Rashi. This could have been taken over by a Jew, and he lived there. And it didn't have to be at the time of the Meroim. It could be a subsequent, obviously more recently, but not very recently. And a Jew lived there, and he was the one who put it into the wall, or the wall that fell down. So why are you hanging your hat on that it belonged to a non-Jew? It could have belonged to a Jew. It could have belonged to someone who took over the house, and everything should belong to the Balabais. So that's just again, this is sort of somewhat of an esoteric kasha, because we don't have carbon dating, so we don't know when this happened. So on the one hand, did it happen at the time of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, or did it happen more recently, but still old? And back in the day, there were no Jews. Okay, so it had to belong to one of the Shiva Amin. But certainly, if it wasn't 1,000 years and it was 200 years or 300 years and there were Yidden there, then it could have belonged to one of them. So why do you automatically say that you don't have to announce? It could have been a family that passed it down to Yerusha, and they're the ones who owned it. Emphasis Gemara Lod Tzricha, top of page Chav Vav Amud Aleph, the Shatach Tvei. So he gives it a different answer. The Shatach Tvei, Choluda Rabba the Kulahai Lo Shabbat Lahu. He's talking about that it was so old that all those objects were either rusty or falling apart, or you can tell that this wasn't of more recent vintage. That's why he uses the term Amorim, because he wants to tell us that something that is Yashan interesting. According to this definition, Yashan means prior to Kibush Eretz Yisrael. So if in Eretz Yisrael you find something, there's antiquities all over the place, and you find an antiquity, then if it's a Yashan, it predates the entry into Eretz Yisrael of the Bnei Yisrael. That's what he's trying to tell us. And again, there are some other Rishonim who explain it differently, but that's what he means by Yashan. It means it's that old. And Rashi kind of supports that indirectly by saying it's so old that there are films and layers of rust and other things on it, which can only have been accumulated by maybe hundreds, if not more years of just lying. What's the upshot? The upshot, whether you say it's 1,000 years old or 500 years old, is that if you come upon something that really has years on it, it's old, then you can assume years. And that's the bottom line. Was there years? Well, certainly from the time of the Meroim, there was years. But the question is, how recent does it have to be that one can say there's no years? So Gemara, the Mishnah is saying, don't worry about it. There is years, and therefore you don't have to announce it. So that's the definition of Kaisel Yashan that the Gemara wants to tell us. Now the Gemara goes on and says, "B'kaisel Chadash." What about a new wall, a fairly new wall? What's the halacha? Says the Mishnah, "Mechetzev v'lechut shelo, mechetzev v'leflim shebalavayis." Half and half. So, okay, maybe that makes sense because you figure that if someone is in the Rishus Harabim, let's say someone is running away from somebody and he sees a wall and a hole, so I'm going to quickly stick it into this wall and then I'll come back and get it, and this way I won't be robbed. So his Havamina was to come back and get it. Now, he may have forgotten, and that's a different story, but that was the Havamina. Therefore, we say, belongs to yeah.
Does this now apply in Eretz Yisrael? Because Jews have been living there a long time. It could have been 2 generations ago, 100 years ago. How far back does it have to be to say that we don't think there's any relatives alive and so on and so forth?
So that's an interesting question because today, well, again, all these finds by the excavations in all of these places, I guess there's no question, there's 100% certainty that they are roughly as old as they're saying. So what you're talking about is you're walking along the street in Katamon in a fairly new house with a wall around it, and there's a hole in the wall, and you stick your hand in, and lo and behold, you take out a 500, if there is a 500 shekel note. So you're asking yourself what to do, or you find something else of value in it, and you're asking yourself, what shall I do with this? Do I have to make some kind of an announcement, or can I just take it? That's really what you're asking. And that's an interesting question. I did not look at the halacha actually to see what the halacha says on this type of thing, and I will. I will take a look and share this week. But again, I think we can say with some degree of certainty that if you find things in a wall that, again, by looking at it, maybe seeing what it is and in what state it's in, you might be able to determine this is something that the Baal will certainly be Irish. But as a practical matter, it's a good question because that's something you or I might do if we were walking along and wanted to hide something in a wall.
Somebody found something that has a family name on it. There's a lot of things that had names put on the objects. Then,
well, if it had a family name, that would be a siman that one that you have to at least investigate. I mean, if that family name exists, then maybe Again, the mitzvah Shabbos Aveda, if you find a name, then that may be proof positive. I think we're talking about where there is a siman, but the siman is not something that, I mean, a siman is something, there's a siman that someone can identify by saying, oh, yes, that was my thing from such and such, but not a name, not that obvious. Yeah, Menashe.
Yeah, so the other question in terms of whether it apply or how it applies today is my understanding, and it seems to be implied by this, and I've certainly, I know over the years, learned other Gemaras with this idea of like if you have a piece of meat in a wall and where it is and whether it might be from a goy. I mean, these walls, that the basic idea that these walls were really thick, like you said, 3-4 feet thick or whatever. They didn't have reinforced concrete and things like that. So these were really, if you wanted a tall wall, it had to be a thick wall. And so people would use it for storage and so on to make double use of it. Whereas most walls today, even around a big building, they're relatively thin and relatively solid. So there may not be as much the concepts apply, but there may not be much practical these days, even in Israel.
Right, yeah. But still, I mean, you're right. So, but the concept is that if walls were made that thick, then maybe people did use them for for public storage for a period of time, and then they forgot about it. So that's the question of years. So I will look at it, Mitzvah, for next week to see what the halacha discusses on this, if at all.
Rabbi, it's worth noting in passing, and I'm sure the Tana was certainly aware of this when he said it, that in Parshas Mitzorah, one of the interpretations is about the walls of houses. The Mitzorah was purposely, the Tzoras was purposely put in there so that the walls would become destroyed and possessions of the Amoraim would be revealed to the Israelite successors.
Right, because they knocked it down. Exactly right. Right. Well, again, I don't think for our discussion we're going back to the days of Saras, but that's a good point. Is that that's how it came out. So, all right. So
Tuvia, quick question. Tuvia, quick question.
Yeah.
In passing, it says with the Nakudos Emorim, meaning the Amorites as opposed to the Amoraim. And I was wondering if, I was a little confused at first. Is that an important point to note?
No, not really. But the Amorites were one of the
7 nations.
Pre-conquest, right?
Okay, so not Tanaim versus Amoraim, not to.
No.
Okay.
It means he means
Okay.
As I said, Achiti, Amori, Frizi. It's the Amorites from back when.
Got it. Okay.
So now Amar Rav Ashi. So here we're going to have an interesting question. Amar Rav Ashi makes a statement. Sikinta basar kasa v'chisa basar shintzia. Generally speaking, a knife, if someone inserts a knife into a wall, we go basar kasa, basar the handle. In other words, when you handle a knife, you hold it by the handle. If someone wanted to put a knife into a wall, he would stick it in with the handle out. Also, a kisa, a purse, basher shansia, it also probably follows the strings or the way you would handle a purse. So,
but Rabbi, wouldn't they
Yeah.
take wouldn't if it was a soldier, it's likely that he would put the handle in first, not because.
right. But I agree. I understand what you're saying. But we're talking about just stamazai, a person who has a knife in his pocket, and for whatever reason he wants to relieve himself of it. I know probably many of us would pick up the handle and stick it in. I wouldn't necessarily, if I'm handing it to someone, the etiquette is to hand it my holding the knife so that he should be able to take the handle, or like you say, a soldier. But we're talking about b'derech klal, when a person has a knife in his pocket or in a sheath and he wants to take it out, he takes it out by the handle and then he moves it that way. So Rav Ashi is now going to ask a kasha. Skinta basa kasa the kisa basa shinsia the elomisnis and the doni mechetzav l'chut shelo mechetzav l'chut shabalabayis the lechse ikata lego ikata levar. Let's see if the handle is facing outside or inside. I should see a lego, you should see a levar. So Rav Ashi is asking a conceptual question. If you have a knife, or let's say something that has a way of handling it. He's talking about a knife because a knife is fairly obvious, but it could be something else. And you handle it a certain way. Why do you go by the where you find it in the wall? Meaning ketzev shalachutz or ketzev shalachim. Why don't you follow how the object was put into the wall? Because the way an object is put into a wall is indicative of who put it in.
But look how you're second guessing the mores of the city.
Right.
You're in a very litigious society where even if the wall is in your private property, if a person sees a hole, an attractive nuisance, and he sticks his hand in there and gets a terrible cut from the pointed edge of the knife, it's a full employment act for lawyers. So the owner will purposely stick it in with the handle. I mean, I know it's convoluted, but if you don't want to hurt passerby, if you care for other people, you may figure, okay, I don't think I need to get rid of this knife right now. I'm doing stuff and the knife is annoying me, but I don't want to chas v'shalom hurt other people in the public area. Nobody's going to go in there anyway, but in case they do, I don't want to hurt them, So
Chaim, you're a forward-thinking person, and I understand that. So, in other words, you're going to have to balance now as to whether or not as you say, the mores of the time, as to whether or not someone would, even from the inside, would push it in handle first in order to protect the public. You're right. I mean, that's an open question. I think Rav Ashi is saying that what was common by him is that that's what people did. People took a knife and held it by the handle and didn't worry about the point or someone else. Again, that's Rav Ashi's probably his thinking here. So as a general rule, now you're right, it could be exceptions, it could be that some people were more sensitive to others, but he's saying as a general rule, this is what people did at the time. And today you may be right. Today maybe because of the litigious society, nobody does it. But at least in Rav Ashi's time, people handled a knife or a purse in a certain sort of way.
Right, and you didn't assume that someone else will stick their hand on the public side of the hole. You just that was like an unlikely possibility.
An unlikely possibility, right? So if it did happen, then you have proof positive as to whose it is just by the way the object lies. So that's what Rav Ashi is saying. What are you, Mishnah, telling me? It all has to do in how it lies. If it lies one way, it's a raya that's Rishus Rabbim, belongs to the Rabbim. If it lies another way, then it's so he says Sekinta, says Rashi Hanimsa be'eched mechorei kaisel. You found a knife in one of the holes. Also kasa ozel. Ikasa legoi b'nei abayis nitnu. If it's facing the inside, then someone from the b'nei abayis did it. Ikasa lebar. If it's facing outside, b'nei Rishus Rabbim. Again, this we're much more, I'll say sophisticated. I don't know if that's the right word. I mean, they were very simple. They did simple things. They followed simple rules. They didn't make things complicated. They did it one way or another way. Today, you have all kinds of cheshbonos. Should I do it sideways, upside down, this way, up, every way? But he's giving us to understand that there was one way or the other way. At least Rav Ashi is. Shekain derech achizosa. He says that's the normal way. Derech achizasa. In other words, there was a norm. Yeah, there were exclusions. People did it another way, but the norm was to do it that way, says Rashi. So l'chara, that's a good kasha. What are you giving me outside, inside, half and half? Let's just see how the object was placed. That alone will tell us. Says the Gemara.
Rabbi,
yeah.
Couldn't they ask that question because we're talking about an old wall?
Right.
But also a pretty wide wall. By
Right.
asking that question, they could determine that it could be very old because if it was put in a certain direction, they may have added to the wall. So it may not have been from the inside. It may have been from the outside.
You mean a wall that was added onto?
Correct. In other words, if a wall is extremely old, it's probably deteriorating. So if they wanted to shore it up again, they would extend it onto it. And if somebody came, put their item into the wall from the old wall, it may have only gone in 6 inches, but they added on another 2 feet on the other side to shore it up. And the hole was on the other side. So if you have to put your hand, 24 inches in or something of that nature, it's going to be very deep. Look at it from the other side.
Yeah, but we're talking about a hole that went all the way through, right? It went from outside to inside. Even if the wall was added, the hole that they dug into that wall would have corresponded to the hole of the yashan, of the older wall. So it really, whether it's an original wall or 2 walls that actually were built at different times, we're talking about a hole that went from outside to inside. So
yeah, but if it was a very old wall, it's very logical that they didn't have mortar like we have now, the concrete. It's very logical that it got a lot of moisture in it. It could have washed itself out, and the hole was all the way through, even through the new one.
Yeah. Well, again, we can speculate, David, on a number of things that could have happened here and how to deal with them. I think we're looking at it from its simplest point of view. A wall was built. Let's just say one wall. It didn't deteriorate. It didn't fall apart. It was one wall. It was 3 feet deep. And now the question is, when you find something in that wall, again, you can measure or you can approximate where the midpoint of the wall is. And we're saying that anything from the midpoint out is from someone from the outside, and from the midpoint in, it's someone from the inside. So now the Gemara declares what kind of what's required. In other words, if you find something on the outside, are you required to announce? You're clearly not required to announce if you find it from the midpoint in. Again, and if it was part of an old wall and then a new wall was built, we can speculate on some of those things and sort of extrapolate what might be the case. But I think let's look at it from its simplest point of view. One wall built at one time, and the question is whether or not there is a responsibility on the finder to make an announcement that he found it so someone can claim it. That's really open and shut. But Ashi is saying it's irrelevant. Why don't you just look at the way the object was put in? He's using a knife as an extreme. Maybe you can with other objects also tell. I don't know. But if it was a knife or if it was a purse, you can tell how it was put in. And the insider wouldn't. Yes, you can argue he was he was careful. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to litigate. But again, in its simplest form, the way it was put in should be the way you determine whether it's part of the Rishus Harabim or part of the Rishus Hayachim. So that's really the question. Says the Gemara, Misnisan ba'adrua v'niska. So again, the Gemara is going to give us a different answer, which will help us understand. Rav Ashi's point is valid only to the degree that you have an object that you can make that determination. A knife is a good example. It has a handle, right? A purse, maybe that in those days, that was a good example because a purse also maybe had some kind of a way of putting it in or not. But here we're talking about the Adra Vaniska. Rashi says the Adra is muchin. That's like a soft fabric. Or niska is palta shel kesef, a bar, a gold bar or a silver bar. A gold bar doesn't have a beginning or an end. It's a bar. You can push it in one way, you can push it in another way. A soft piece of fabric doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's a piece of fabric. So if you find most of the things he's saying that you're going to find aren't going to have a beginning and an end like a knife. So Rav Ashi's statement wouldn't be valid to our Mishnah because our Mishnah is talking about most cases where there isn't a beginning and an end. You're right. If it's a handle, you might be right. If it's a handle, you might say, you know what, it probably belongs to Rosh Hashanah because that's the way it was put in, especially in the times of Rav Ashi. But for the most part, you're talking about most things, someone stuffs it in. A piece of cloth, you don't think about it. You stuff it in. You stuff it from the outside, you stuff it from the inside. And a bar of gold is uniform. I could stick it in from the inside, I can stick it in from the outside. So we're back to square one. So therefore, we have to determine that the way you decide whether or not the finder has to have a responsibility of making an announcement is by the where you find it in the wall, or the likelihood is. And again, it's not 100%. You're right. Someone from the inside may have pushed it way beyond the midpoint. But we're going now, Busser, Rove, Busser, what is maybe what we will consider the norm. And the Gemara and the Mishnah says you got to go by the norm. The norm is half in, half out. So that's how he answers it. So you can't really bring a raya from Rav Ashi that you should look at the object as to the way it was put in, because that object was an unusual object. It was a knife. Now, says the Gemara, and this is a chiddush. Tana im haya kaisel mamula. No, I'm sorry. Tana im haya kaisel mamula mehen cholkin. Yeah, if the whole wall was filled from end to end, it was filled with stuff. Who knows what people put in there? Cholkin, says the Gemara, you divide it by the midpoint. Frag the Gemara, pshita. What chiddush are you telling me? We're talking about chetzev v'lefnim, chetzev v'lefnim. What difference does it make if it was one object sitting there, or whether it was wall to wall filled with stuff? Over the course of time, people constantly kept putting things in those holes. So what's the chiddush? And for the Gemara, lo tzricha the mishba b'chad gisa. Over time, the wall tilted, so that it was like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It was a wall that was almost leaning severely to one side. I would have thought that, you know what, where you find it is what you do. If the wall is at a extreme angle and most of the stuff is leaning either inside to the owner or outside, that's where it belongs. And for the Gemara, Kamash Malan, know that you don't. Now, you're gonna have a tough time figuring out what's outside, what's inside, but we don't automatically say that if it's tilted towards the owner, that everything is for the owner. In other words, again, it's a little bit maybe out of the realm, but if someone sticks his hand into a wall that has a severe angle and comes up with something, that something clearly is going to be mechutz, because it's sitting on top of everything else. And if you were to straighten the wall out and even it out, then what he's finding on the top of that pile is an outsider. If he goes from the other side, then that's an insider. The tougher part is going to be how you're going to figure what the midpoint is. So in other words, if you have a wall that's 3 feet and the wall is tilted and everything is now in the lower half, so if he sticks his nose in and says, oh, there's all kinds of things here, what he's picking out from the top is outside, and maybe the next layer and then the next layer, it's going to be hard to figure out where that midpoint is. But the chiddush of the Gemara is, you don't say it's automatically the owner's because everything is in the lower half. That doesn't fly. The lower half doesn't automatically own everything. Rather, there has to be some equity. How you figure out, we're not going to try to determine that here. But that's the chiddush. The chiddush is that, because he says, Pshita, of course, cholkin. What are you talking about? That's the halacha. That's what the Mishnah says. So the cholkin here is that if it's one-sided, everything went to one side, you're still cholkin. You have to figure out how to divide it, but it's cholkin. It's divisible. Yeah. Okay, Chaim, you had a kasha or no?
Well, not really, no. So the commonality here is that you don't make assumptions based on the uniqueness of something. We
Right.
can't draw any conclusions based on the knife with the handle because there are many more uniform devices that
Right.
don't give you that. And likewise here, we can't draw a conclusion from a very angled or tilted wall because it's just not the norm. So
Right.
halacha doesn't.
So we're dealing, I mean, this is unusual to us, but we're probably dealing in a society where this was much more common. People would stuff things in walls.
It makes sense because if you go to the Kotel Maravi, for example, and I know you're not supposed to stick your hand in too far because you may go onto the Harabay's side, if you will. But those were very thick walls. I mean, you could, they're literally the length of an arm. I mean, you could stick
Right.
some.
Yeah, but it must have been more, at least from what we can
Yeah.
glean here, must have been more common for people to actually do this, to stick things into walls with the idea that I'm going to come back and get it, or I want to hide it for now, and this is a good way to hide it. That
They
must
didn't
have
have
been
lockers. They didn't have lockers where you could put a quarter in.
right, right, exactly. So l'chayra, that's what we could take from this. A little bit hard for us in our time, who sticks things in walls, what are we doing? But technically, that's what they did. So Rashi says, "Mamula min hachefet shemachzik kol rechov hakaisel." So actually, Rashi is saying you could have had numerous things sticking in there, or one item. Maybe there was one long item that someone stuck into the wall and went from end to end. That poses an interesting question. If you have one, like a pole or something that can go the length of the wall, and we're saying that half of it is Rosh Hashanah, belongs to Rosh Hashanah, that's a little bit tough, because if it's one item, clearly either it was put in by one person on the outside or by the owner on the inside. It wasn't two people who put in one item. But from Rashi, it seems to be that one item going the whole width of the kaisel is also technically disputable.
Excuse me, Rabbi.
Yeah,
It's sort of strange to me anyway, that people walking in the Rosh Hashanah would put something private of their own into a wall as a temporary holding place. It would seem more logical that somebody found something on the ground and then he put it into a wall that was available, an opening, and either come back or figure out what to do with it. But to put your private valuable stuff.
that's a good point, Jay, that's a good point. I mean,
So the
but again,
object
we have to put ourselves in the mindset of people at that point in time. Maybe walls were like lockers, or again, maybe someone had to unload because he was being chased, or he thought someone would steal it. Again, we have to. It's very unusual for us today.
Well, there's
but-
another example, though, which is we have all these things about, I mean, it's a mitzvah, specifically mitzvah. If your animal's overloaded, you have to, somebody else then comes along, they have to help, etc. People would load up their animal, they have to go a long distance. They couldn't just rent a U-Haul to have more space. So they'd have their animal, they load it up, and then things gets overloaded. So they take some stuff off. They think they're going to come back the next time through, and then they forget.
Good point. Good point. So in other words, we can conjure up many different reasons why someone would do it. Jay, you make a good point. It really could be that someone else picked it up and stuck it in, and it wasn't even his. But he figured, whoever lost it would come back and find it. I mean, we do that sometimes too. We don't want to move away something from a place because, or like last week's Mishnah, you find something behind a wall. Someone put it there. Don't remove it because he'll never find it. So these are all good possibilities of what happened in those times as to why people would use walls that have holes in them for storage. But clearly it happened. So the Gemara is addressing it and giving us some different ideas. And again, halacha l'maisa, it may not have an effect, but if you take this forward to our time now, and you think about things in our time, some of these halachas could play a role in understanding in the modern age as to whether or not, even in the technology age, there are things that we're bound to do based on these halachas. Okay, so I mean, we can put our minds to it. I'm sure we can come up with different scenarios today that to which this Gemara or these halachas have a practical applicability. So we can think about that, but all these are good points because all of them are relevant to what we're saying. So says Rashi, it tilted to one side. Mahu the tema b'chatzi hagova hoyot tchila v'ashtupucha ashtavach l'tzad hanomoch. The one time was on one side, meaning let's say the Rosh Hashanah. Now it all fell to the other side. Therefore, it should all belong to the Balabas. Kamash Malan. No, that you don't say that now all of it fell to one side, Rosh Hashanah or the Balabas. Therefore, it's all his. You've got to at least approximate the midpoint and say half and half. Okay, so let's finish the last part of this Mishnah. If he rented to others, then even if he finds it in the house, it should belong to him. Right? The Gemara, Va'amai lezel basabasra. Why do you say that you don't have to announce? Let's just assume it belonged to the last person who was there. And you have to, if you know his name, or if you can announce his name, then you have to return it. Why are we making it so simple for the guy to keep it? It makes sense. Milo Tanan, didn't we learn, and this is a very interesting Rashi he's talking about. There is a mitzvah of Masa Oni, of Masa Sheni. Masa Sheni means that 4 times in 7 years, first year, second year, I think 5th and 6th, when you don't give Masa Rishon or Masa Oni, you have Masa Sheni. So Masa Sheni, in biblical times, you had to bring up to Eretz Yisrael, and you had to eat it there. Now, a farmer who has
Yerushalayim.
Pardon?
You're in Yerushalayim. You have to bring it to Yerushalayim.
You have to bring it to Yerushalayim, and you have to eat it in Yerushalayim. Now, a person who is a large farmer has a lot of produce. He brings it to Yerushalayim. He can't eat it all up. Impossible. So he exchanges it for money, and with that money, you're going to buy food. Now, if you have that much money and you're there for what, 8 days, 7 days, 9 days, whatever it is, and you go home, you can't take it home with you. So what do you do with that money? So Rashi and others say that typically they gave it to aniyim, or they gave it to family members with the condition that they had to use it. So the chiddush here is that maybe some of them use it for food, but most of them use it to buy korbanos. They would bring a korban shlamim, and that would be the use of the Masa Sheni money. So apparently that was very prevalent that they use that money for korbanos. So says the Brisa like this: you're going to the stall of someone who sells animals, and you find all kinds of coins all over the ground. So he says money that's found in front of the sochre behema, in front of the stall of the person who's selling the behemoths. Again, what are they selling them for? For the korbanos. Is la'olam masa. That's considered masa. Why? Because we're saying that when the chag ended, right, the regal ended, and people left, all this money was lying around. So that money belonged to the last person who was there. Now, you're not giving it back to them because they left home. They went to Tel Aviv, Cologne, Haifa, whatever. But the concept is that money was belonged to the last person who was there. That's the raya he wants to bring. So in other words, if you find money sitting there in front of the stall of a seller, you can assume it was Maser money because the last people there were probably Ole Regalim who had Maser money. And you don't say, oh, it was someone from the town who dropped it 6 months ago. We don't say that. So he wants to bring a raya that you should go to according to the last person who was there. So that's his raya. Now, Agavorcha, Baharabayas Chulin. If the money was found on Harabayas, we say it was Chulin. We'll see why. Uberushalayim b'shayim osashana Chulin b'shas haregel hakol maser. So what is this brisa telling us? This brisa is telling us we could very much rely on the last person who was there. In the case of maser money, it doesn't matter who was there, but it was someone who was doing maser. So if that's the case, then it was maser money. Then in our Gemara as well, the last person there should be the one to whom you should return it. That's the proof he wants to bring. Okay, so Rav Shami ben Zari is going to give us a little bit of explanation about this maser business. My Tama, what's the reason why you go after the last? He wants to tell us that Yerushalayim was a very clean city, and that the sanitation department of Yerushalayim swept every day. So if they swept every day, that means they swept yesterday, and today, which is now Oila Regel, it's new money. In other words, the point he makes is it's not old money pre-Regel, it's new money because of the people who came for the Regel. So therefore, Alma Omrinan Kamai Kamai Oslo Bahana Achrinaninu. Whatever was there before was cleaned up, and this is new. Hochanami Kamai Kamai Oslo Bahana the Basarhu. And this should be the last money. Again, it's a long way of saying, why are you saying that you don't announce? You should definitely announce, and he brings this long, extravagant, winded proof from the time of the Beis Hamikdash, from the time of Oila Regel, when they came to the basement, is that people brought money, and there was an assumption that it was maser money, and people would buy karbanis and use them. Say the same thing here, very simply.
Well,
Yeah,
what's the case here? What's the case here, the local case?
The local case is that he rents out his house.
All right, then why is there any similarity? In the municipality of Yerushalayim, they're sweeping it clean every day, so you kind of have to be concerned that what you found in the past 24 hours or 23 hours is from an ani and is miser money. But you rent a one-room or a two-room apartment to somebody, you can't make that assumption.
Well, I think he's making the assumption at the very least that the owner of the house is going to clean and sweep the house for the next guest. In other words, I own a rental, and somebody is there.
Okay, that's the parallel. Okay.
Yeah, that's the parallel. The parallel is that you would normally at least clean it up, because he's saying that he found something. He's sweeping up from the last guy to rent it to the new guy, and he finds something, and the Gemara says he doesn't have to announce. Why shouldn't he announce? It clearly was this guy. We're saying that it was this guy. Okay, so Amar Resh Lakish, Mishum Bar Kapara. So Resh Lakish says the name Bar Kapara. No, our case is speaking She'asu Pundik L'Shlosha. He created an inn, right? He made this house into an inn. And in this inn, he had 3 rooms. 3 guests could be there at a time. So what is he coming to tell us? He's coming to tell us that when you have a rooming house and it has 3 people, and Rashi will learn that Rashi in a minute, and this is fascinating because of the ramifications, then you don't have to announce. Why? Because when you have 3 people, it's possible it belongs to any of the 3, and the person who lost it will be miyayish. Why will it be miyayish? Because he asked each one, and each one said, not me, I didn't take anything. I mean, I didn't. So in other words, he's kind of lost. There's nothing that he can do if you have 3 people and you lose it. Now, if it's 2 people, It's a whole different story. We're going to see from Rashi also that if you have two people and one loses it, then he can make the other person make a shvua. Remember, shvua is hesses. He can make him make a shvua that he didn't take it. Whole different ballgame when you're talking about a shvua. But when you have three people and you suspect one of them on suspicion alone, you can't make a shvuas hesses. You can't force someone to swear on a maybe. So and here he's going to ask one person, and he's going to say, me? No, I didn't find anything. Ask the other person, no, I didn't find anything. So what's he going to do? So he's going to be miyayish.
Right.
And if he's miyayish, then you don't have to announce. So it's a very interesting set of circumstances that he's answering us. He's saying, I'm not arguing with you if you have a one room inn and someone leaves. Yeah, sure, you have to announce, at least consider it belongs to that people, to that one person. But when you have an inn and that has three people, now, I don't think we have the time now, it's 11, unless we have more time, but you're going to have all kinds of questions. Are they B'nai Yisrael? Are they B'nai Akum? Are they Jewish tenants? Are they non-Jewish tenants? All of these are very interesting questions. But as a matter of course, the fact that it's three people renting means that you now are in a quandary as to what to do. So that's why he's saying over here, you don't have to return it, because he's asking these people and they're saying no. So there's no way that he can get to it. That's what he means. Let's take a look at Rashi. Okay, so לפני סכר בהמה בירושלים לעולם בין בשעת הרגל ובין שלא בשעת הרגל מעשר שרוב בשר הנאכל בירושלים מעשר, because most of the meat or the food that's eaten in Yerushalayim during the regal is מעשר, לפי שאין אדם שיהיה בירושלים עד שיאכל כל מעשרותיו. A person doesn't leave until he eats everything, or if an osun mos masal la'oni ha'ir, or if he can't finish it, he gives it to the oni ha'ir, or la'ohavo, or to his relatives, yoshvei ha'ir. But rov ha'tzos maser lokim behem behemis. And what do these people do? They don't necessarily eat it themselves. They buy behemis l'shlamim, for a carbon shlamim, k'degam sham maser shlamim mesechtes menachos, where it tells us that the excess was usually used for kavanos. So therefore, he says, if you find any of this money in front of the stall of these mochre behema, then 99 times out of 100, it's masa money. B'harabayis chulin, as an aside, he says on harabayis it's chulin. Ba'afilu b'shas haregel, even during the regel, it's chulin. V'afapi sherov mos shebe'ir maser she'olu regalim meviyim mos masreim la'achlam. Even though most of the money in the city is masa money, because people come. Lo shavkina ruba deshata vazlina basa regel alaminum fnei regel naflu kan b'chulinhem. With regard to the harabayis, we say that most people did not bring their didn't go there, so they didn't bring their maser money. So we say that this is old money from people who through the year would come to visit the harabayis, and it's considered chulin. So with regard to the harabayis, he says there's no chazaka that it was maser. It's just, I mean, it's an observation he's making that there isn't the traffic, and people just wouldn't come with all that money and drop it off in the harabayis. The Rav Moshe Be'er Chulin. In most of the year, it's Chulin money, because we're talking about what we know as Western Yerushalayim and not the old city, or not, where the Harabayis is. But Ubishas Regel Masa Sharov Mos Ir Masa. Again, he's making a very clear distinction between Regel and not Regel, and from that he wants to bring about. Rab Shammai Vazera, my time Yerushalayim Bishas Regel Masa. Why don't we say that it is the regular money from the year and not new money? So he says, Yerushalayim, no, we call Yerushalayim Ir Hanikia, a clean city. So in other words, it's swept every day. It's already cleaned off from the market, but it's not in the market anymore. You don't have to sweep harabayis every day. He gives a different reason. He doesn't say because there's an isser to go. He's saying because there isn't a lot of dirt and clay and other things from the shoes that gathers there, which requires the sweepers to sweep every day. And also because it's slanted, so things will fall down. It's kind of an interesting view. Harabayis is not flat. It's flat. So if someone comes to Harabayis and drops something, or he has dirt on his shoe or whatever, it will tend to roll downhill. So the sweepers, he's saying, don't have to come in every day and sweep Harabayis clean, because for the most part, it remains clean. Yeah, in other words, you take your shoes off or you clean your shoes. Bottom line, he's just explained to us why on Harabayis it's considered chulin and not hegdish, because it's not as well frequented, of course, and it's clean enough that the sweepers don't have to sweep every day. Therefore, it's quite likely that money that if someone did drop a coin, it could have been from a month ago, or from well before the regel. Alma b'davar she'aseh lehischabe. Okay, so that's later in the Gemara. So now we have an answer that pundik l'shlosha, that since it's an inn, it's 3 people, and with 3 people you can't be certain who took it. So therefore he's meyayish. The whole question was, do you have to announce or not? The teretz says you don't announce, but it's because the person who lost it is meyayish, because the 3 people, each one says it wasn't me. You have no way of determining who actually took it. Therefore, he has to be meyayish. That's how the Gemara ends, and that's why he says it's not a raya. It's not a raya that it's the last person. That's how he ends. So I think we'll stop here, because now the Gemara is going to go into this whole discussion, whether it is pundik l'shlosha, whether you'll see how complicated it gets, whether it's only for Jewish tenants or even Oidei Kachavim. But this is what we'll pick up into next week. So again, as far as our Mishnah is concerned, we've now kind of answered all 3 circumstances as to why you don't announce. And for better or for worse, we have to accept those answers. Certainly in the time of the Gemara, it was different than our time. But so we say for an old wall, you don't announce at all. For a new wall, it's chetzia chetzia. And at the end of the day, you don't have to announce if you have a tenant. You don't have to announce or turn to him and ask him if it's his, because as the Gemara answers here, we're talking about an inn of 3 people, and an inn of 3 people, there is yiyush. We accept it and we say that there's yiyush. Right?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Yeah. So there's a lot more on this, and we'll pick it up next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.